Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Duncan Young. I'm the head of the 2016 Census of Population and Housing. I'm back home. Hobart's my hometown, but I currently live in Canberra and ran the census program from Canberra. But it's a great pleasure to be back here to present some of the census results today. I'll be tag teaming today, so you don't get sick of my voice, is with my colleague Georgia Chapman. So Georgia was the census director responsible for Tasmania in 2016 and is now the ABS's state partnership manager for state government here in Tasmania. So we'll be switching over as we share some of the census data that we've seen from 2016. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Mui Nina people, the traditional custodians of the land and on which we are presenting on today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future, and acknowledge any members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who are joining us here today. I'd also like to let everyone know that this session is being live webcasted, so whilst we're presenting here in a room, we're also presenting live on the web across who knows where across Tasmania or across the world. And so just so you're aware, when we have an opportunity for some questions later on if you ask questions, you will also be live webcasted across the world or to wherever we're broadcasting. So just so you're aware of that. Today we're going to focus on the census data and what it tells us about Australia, but also what it tells us about Tasmania and what it tells us about the beautiful city here of Hobart. So why is the census important? Well, the census is Australia's most comprehensive and detailed picture of Australia's people and the households in which they live, and gives us the most accurate picture of how Australia is changing. And the census underpins a number of important things for Australia. It's critical to democracy in Australia, so the census data is used to produce our population estimates, which are used to set our electoral boundaries, set our number of seats in Parliament, and also are used to distribute government funding, so like the GST, across each state and territory. We've also know that census data is heavily used for government planning, policy development and administration. It's also used as a basis of every ABS statistics that our organisation produces. And we produce over 500 statistics every single year, and whether they're economic statistics about businesses or social statistics about the people of Australia, all of those are benchmarked against based using the census data. So it's a really critical part of what we do as an organisation for Australia. It's also our most used data source, and so I'm really pleased that we've just ticked over 1 million uses of quick stats and community profiles on our website since release. On the first day it opened, Table Builder, which I'm sure some of you know how to use, served up 1.6 billion cells of data. So it's an incredibly popular data set, and one which we can all access and we can all relate to, because we know that we're in it. So since census night and the census collection period 11 months ago, we've been pretty busy trying to convert all of the data that we received into the statistics that we're going to share today. And so we've had over 700 coding and processing staff working through the process of turning your marks on a form, your written responses into the statistics. And so I can tell you that doctors in Australia aren't the only people with messy handwriting. There's a lot of messy handwriting in Australia, and we had 3.5 million paper forms and many more than that electronic forms that we've brought in and brought data out of. It's taken some 5.3 billion data transactions, some 23 million clerical operations, in order for us to curate and produce 68.9 million pieces of data that we've already released on the website. I'm not going to cover all of those today. Actually, my team tell me if we did cover them all, it would take us 2 years without sleeping just to mention every single number. So we're just going to give you some highlights today and try and hopefully inject in you some interest in the data, but it leads you to go and explore it a little bit further. So the census is our highest quality data set that we produce at the ABS, and we've got a number of different measures of quality of the census data set. Firstly, Eve was the response rate. So the census last year had a response rate of 95.1% of dwellings in Australia completed their census forms. This is right on par with what we've seen in the past. So we're a bit over 96% in 2011 and we're under 96% in 2006. And it's right on par with what we see in comparable countries, so in New Zealand, in the UK, in Canada. And if anyone's conducted a survey before, you're pretty rapt if you've got a 95% response rate for that. So it's very representative of our population. One of the really great advantages we've got with the census data set this time was the significant increase in the number of people participating online. So there was an increase of over 80% of people participating online, and so 63.3% of responses came through our online form. Why this is important to us is when we look at the data from the online form, we see that people actually leave less questions blank than on the paper form. And the fact that the form takes people to the questions they need to answer and also can ask sort of follow-up questions to help them complete it, they can actually fill out more accurate answers. A really simple example is that in the past, lots of people have put down their occupation as being a teacher, which is a great occupation. But if you're on the Department of Education trying to plan for teachers in Australia, you actually want to know, are they a primary school teacher, a secondary teacher, do they teach at TAFE? So the online form actually asked a follow-up question which said, it's great that you're a teacher, but which one of these teachers are you? And allowed people to provide that extra information, which has given us a better data set this time. The third and final measure I'll mention today is our net undercount. So for the ABS, we love conducting a survey. So one survey is not enough of a census. We go out after the census to 50,000 homes in Australia and interview the people in those homes to try and find out who we've missed in the census and who we've counted more than once. You might find it hard to believe that some people like the census so much they do fill out more than one form, and so we need to work out how many people have we counted twice, how many people have we missed. And what we found this census was that our census population count was 1% below what our estimate was of a full population that night. That's actually the lowest net undercount that we've had in the recorded history of censuses. So we know that we've got a really high quality data set. So as well as talking about Australia, I'm going to talk about the Greater Hobart region. And so this Greater Hobart region isn't just here in the CBD, stretches out to Richmond, Brighton, Kingston and Sorell. So we'll talk a little bit through this presentation comparing statistics at different geographies. And so the Greater Hobart capital city area will be one of the key geographies we use in today's presentation. So on census night, we counted 23,401,892 usual residents in Australia. We also counted over 300,000 overseas visitors, which were temporarily in Australia on census night, and we take them away from account before we produce estimated resident population. And what we don't count in the census is the number of Australians which are overseas on census night. But from our immigration records, we know that over 600,000 people were overseas on census night, probably having a better night than I had, and we use the immigration records we get from them to add them back into the population count, so that when we produce our estimated resident population, it represents all Australians, whether they happen to be in Australia on census night or not. And so we found that by December 31st last year, Australia's population had grown to some 24.4 million. The population increase over the last 5 years was 8.8%. That's only slightly higher than it's been sort of on average in every 5-year period since Federation. And our population's doubled since 1966 and doubled again since 1921. So in the lifetime of our centenarians, we've seen the Australian population increase some 4 times of what it was when they were born. And I just met my new nephew Oscar, who's come along here today. He's 3 months old, and so to imagine what Australia might look like in 100 years from now on the growth rates that we've seen consistently over the course of Australia will be 100 million people by the time that he's sitting around out in 100 years' time. Population of Australia is very heavily focused on the eastern side of Australia. So over 80% of our population are in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria or the ACT. So very much on the eastern side of the country, with New South Wales still clearly our most populous state with 7.5 million people. Tasmania got over 500,000 people counted in the census for the first time. So nice milestone for us Tasmanians. The growth rate of each state was quite variable across the country though. So whilst you had at some states or territories like WA, ACT and Victoria were growing by over 10% over the last 5 years, you had at South Australia and Tasmania growing much slower than that. So the population of Tasmania only grew by 3.0% over the last 5 years, South Australia by 5.0%. So quite a variable kind of population growth across Australia. Whilst across Australia we've got a lot of amazing towns and cities, the vast majority of Australians live in a capital city, and an increasing proportion. So 2 out of every 3 Australians live in a capital city within Australia, so like Hobart, but more likely like Sydney or like Melbourne. And actually capital cities were growing at nearly twice the rate of the other parts of states over the last 5 years. So 10.5% compared to 5.7% across the rest of the states. One of the significant drivers of our growth of capital cities has been international migration. So if we look at all international migration to Australia over the last 25 years, is 86% of all of the migrants which have arrived in Australia over the last 25 years now call a capital city home. So as our population continues to sort of shift its growth more from migration than fertility, we'll expect to see on the current trends our capital cities continue to grow. The picture here in Tasmania, like in lots of areas, is a little bit different, and Tasmania is certainly nowhere near as capital city centric as the mainland states. So here in Tasmania, only 44% of the population are in Hobart, compared to 56% and around the rest of the state. So capital city growth rates are always very interesting, they present a slightly different picture to our state and territory picture. So you see Darwin emerge here. Darwin actually grew the fastest of any capital cities over the last 5 years. But what sparks a lot of interest is the comparable growth rates between Melbourne and Sydney, where Melbourne has been growing now consistently faster than Sydney for some time. And so this is the population growth between Melbourne and Sydney. I showed this slide in Melbourne. I wasn't brave enough to show it in Sydney. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to see it. So Sydney sort of got ahead of Melbourne a bit through around 2000. Sydney Olympics was a great migration into Sydney, but since then Melbourne's been catching up. And in fact, Melbourne over the last 5 years has grown by some 1,856 people every single week since the last census. So it's a lot of new people to call a city home. And so we'll come out with our population projections later this year, and they'll come out with a new estimate of when Melbourne will eclipse Sydney as being Australia's most populous city. Australia's population isn't just growing, it's getting older. And so this is the population age-sex pyramid of the Australian population in 1991, so some 25 years is before the last census. And so I get a bit excited about population age-sex pyramids, and then so a bit of a statistician's favourite thing. And so what does this represent? Well, it's got males on the left and females on the right. It's got the age groups in 5-year age groups, from 0 to 4 at the bottom up to 95 plus at the top. And the length of the line represents the proportion of the overall population that are that age. So what we can see here in 1991 is that at the most common age in the Australian population was 30 to 34 years. It was a pretty solid block all the way through to 44 years, and then in every age group after that there was sort of a reduction in ages. Now, if we fast forward some 25 years, we get a bit of a different shape, this blue shape overlaid on the top here. What you can see here is there's been what demographers call the middle age spread. So you can see that all of that extra blue lines in that area from 45 to 49 right through to 65 to 69 year of age, and a bit of a bite out of the younger ages. So we're shifting as a population to an older population. And this shift's happening quite quickly. So in 2011, 1 in 7 of the population were over the age of 65. In 2016, it's now 1 in 6 of the population are over the age of 65. The growth rate right at the top end is even faster in the 85 pluses in the population. So there's some 486,842 Australians now over the age of 85. In that cohort there you can see a little bit more activity happening on the right than the left, and that's because 2 in 3 of our 85 pluses in Australia are female, as females tend to survive longer than males. So if we take this picture now and then bring it closer to home here in Tasmania and overlay the rest of Australia with Tasmania, what you see in Tasmania is an older state yet again. And so in Tasmania, we're just about we probably by now have passed 100,000 Tasmanians over the age of 65. At census time, it was actually 98,638 Tasmanians over the age of 65. And so that's just under 1 in 5 in the Tasmanian population. The Tasmanian median age is 42, which is the middle age if you lined everyone up in Tasmanian age order, compared to 38 across the rest of Australia. We can look at this a little bit further within Tasmania and split it up between Hobart and the rest of the state. What you can see here is that in Hobart there's a much greater presence of 20 to 40-year-olds than there is in the rest of the state, with the rest of the state with an older age profile again. So outside of Hobart, we're now over 1 in 5 are over the age of 65, so 20.6% of people living outside of Hobart. And so this reflects both long-term students could be in the usual residence picture, but also people moving from other areas into Hobart for employment and through their sort of younger working age years. But 2017 is a special year for Australia because it's the 50th anniversary of Australia's referendum that led to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders being fully included in the census for the first time, which was the 1971 census. In the 1971 census, we counted some 120,000 Australians who identified as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin. That number's increased by over 5 times by 2016. So there's now over 649,171 Australians that identified as having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin. In that same time period, Australia's population's doubled and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population's increased some 5 times. This increase over the last 5 years was 18.3%, so significantly higher than the 8.8% of Australia's population overall. But interestingly, the growth was largely in the eastern states and Tasmania. So in New South Wales, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population grew by 25% in the last 5 years. In Queensland, it grew by 20%. In Victoria, it grew by 26%. Whereas in the Northern Territory, it only grew by 3%. So there's certainly a shifting of the centre of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population within Australia. Here in Hobart, we counted some 8,534 people who identified as having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin, which is 3.8% of the Hobart population. So a higher proportion of the population than there is in Australia overall. The age-sex pyramid of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders against a non-Indigenous population, again, tells quite a dramatic story here. So what you can see here is a significantly younger population, so half the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population are under the age of 25, compared to 1 in 3 of a population of the non-Indigenous population of Australia. And you can also see a significantly smaller older cohort, so only 1 in 20 of the population of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are over the age of 65. So this reflects a shorter life expectancy, but also reflects a higher fertility and a higher birth rate amongst the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. We've seen the median age of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population increase from 21 years to 23 years over the last 5 years. However, that's significantly lower than that Australian figure of 38 that I mentioned earlier. So Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population predominantly lives in New South Wales or Queensland. So some 62% of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population live in one of those 2 states. That's the column on the left. The column on the right represents a proportion of each state and territory that have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin. And what you can see clearly stands out there is the Northern Territory, where more than 1 in every 4 people in the Northern Territory population have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander origin. And Tasmania actually has the second highest proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders within their population of any of the states and territories. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Georgia now to talk a little bit about the cultural and linguistic diversity of Australia.
Thanks, Duncan. Pre-warning, I'm actually not as funny as Duncan, so it's going to be pretty boring. But it can't be boring because it's census data. So we're going to look at the cultural diversity. Australia is a very culturally diverse nation, with the 2016 census showing we have over 180 countries of birth, over 300 different ancestries, and over 300 different languages spoken at home. The chart behind me here shows how our migration is shaping our population. In 2016, we've actually reached a bit of a tipping point, with nearly half of our country either born overseas or having at least one parent born overseas. So to explain the graph a bit more, the blue section is first-generation Australians, which are those Australians born overseas who have come subsequently to live here. Of people who reported a response to the country of birth question, first-generation Australians make up 28% of the population. What I found interesting is that Australia has a higher proportion of first-generation migrants than New Zealand, the UK, US or Canada. The grey area is our second-generation Australians. These are Australians who were born here with at least one parent born overseas. And the section in green is third-plus generation Australians. Both they and their parents were born in Australia. Tasmania had a 6.2% growth in first-generation migrants between 2011 and 2016. But where do our migrants live? So this graph shows that where each of our first-generation migrants live. So it's a count of people born overseas living in each state. 83% of the overseas-born population live in a capital city, compared with 61% of people born in Australia. It's similar to what Duncan was saying earlier. And for Australia's overseas-born population, New South Wales was still the most populous state or territory to live in 2016, with over 2 million people, or 34% of the overseas-born population. When we look at the proportion of overseas-born and Australian-born persons across each state, the 2016 census revealed that almost 1/3 of Western Australia's population was born overseas. They actually had the highest proportion of their population born overseas, closely followed by New South Wales and Victoria on 28%. In comparison, Tasmania had the lowest percentage, with just over 12% of its population born overseas. Greater Hobart was slightly higher than that, with 13.8% of people in that region. Going to our next graph, we're going to drill down a little bit, and we're going to look at some of the capital city data. So I've got two of those pie graphs here, one for Melbourne, Greater Melbourne, and one for Greater Hobart. So we're going back to the generations. So Greater Melbourne actually has 36.1% of its population born overseas and 25.1% second-generation migrants. Greater Hobart has 14.8% of its population born overseas, first-generation migrant, or 14.6% second-generation migrant, with 70.6% third or more generation. I'm going to slice it a little bit differently. Let's look at the changing face of migration over the last 50 years. This is a 50-year view of Australia's migrant population. While the most common birthplace, other than Australia, is still England, we can see that proportionally it has declined quite a lot over the last 50 years. 50 years ago, in 1966, Australia's overseas-born population was only 18% of the total Australian population. A third of this population was born in England, and only 1.6% came from India and China combined. While the most common birthplace for those born overseas remains England, which is 15% of the overseas-born population, there has been an increase between the 2011 and 2016 censuses in the proportion of people born in China, 6% to 8.3%, and India, 5.6% to 7.4%. The proportion of those born in New Zealand has decreased over the same period, dropping 9.1% to 8.4% of the overseas born population. I know. There we are. But if we take it over a shorter period of time, so since 2007, the last 10 years shows a different picture. The above 5 countries on the slide make up nearly 50% of migration, with England being the only European nation. India makes up the highest proportion at nearly 14%, China just above 13%. This has led to a dramatic shift. In the year 2000, Australia had more than twice as many overseas-born people from Europe than Asia. Just 15 years later, 20% more of us are born in Asia than Europe. And because we love that age-sex pyramid, I'm going to give you another one. We've got, here's an age-sex pyramid of our European-born migrants versus our Asian-born migrants. It also shows the changing migration patterns over time. Australia largely had migration from European nations from the end of the Second World War through to 1975. However, in the last 40 years, it shifted dramatically towards Asia. Given the relatively recent increase in Asian migration, those born in Asia had a younger age profile with a median age of 35 years. By contrast, people born in Europe had a median age of 59 years, remembering that the median age of total Australia is 38 years. So our Asian-born migrants were much younger, had a median age much younger, and our European migrants much older. Looking at age cohorts, the largest age cohort for European-born is 60 to 65 years, and for the Asian-born, it's 30 to 34 years. Let's drill down to Tasmania. This is a graph of the top 10 countries of birth for Tasmania, excluding Australia. 2011 is represented by the blue bars and 2016 is the orange. In 2011, those born in England made the largest proportion of all overseas-born people in Tasmania. While that stayed the same in 2016, there have been some changes in the country of birth, with England, Scotland, Netherlands and Germany all declining in number, and China, India, USA, Philippines and South Africa all increasing. The Chinese-born population in Tasmania actually increased 59% between 2011 and 2016, while Indian-born population increased 35%. Another way to slice it, let's look at the fastest growing countries of birth. Tasmania had a 6.1% increase in overseas born, but it was actually much faster, a greater increase for some countries of birth. So the blue bars are the total number of people from each country of birth, and the orange line is actually the percentage increase between 2011 and 2016. As you can see, Afghanistan actually had a 586% increase in its population. Pakistan was the next highest at 215%, noting that they were actually small numbers to start with in 2011. And then we go down to China, which actually was the largest of this population group, a touch over 3,000 people, still grew 59% in the last 5 years. Another way to look at it, here's top country of birth by area for Greater Hobart. So we've divided Greater Hobart into a statistical area level 2, which is equivalent approximately to a suburb. We've excluded England, New Zealand and Australia, as these are overwhelmingly the largest countries of birth. And this is the top country of birth for each of those SA2s. Most notably, I found it interesting that Nepal and Bhutan were actually were the highest country of birth around the Muna Glenorchy area, China, around the city and the university campus, and a number of other ones all spotted around, like Granton with having India. I thought it was all very interesting. Moving on to ancestry. Over 300 ancestries were separately identified in the 2016 census. Ancestry is an indication of the cultural group that a person most closely identifies with. Ancestry provides a different indicator of cultural diversity that may not be picked up by country of birth or parents, or language spoken at home. Interestingly enough, European ancestries dominate the top 10, with 7 ancestries from Europe. The other 3 were Australian, Chinese, and Indian. 10 ancestries with over 5,000 responses more than doubled over the last 5 years. This was led by Chin with a 311% increase, Punjabi with a 191% increase, and Hazara at a 150% increase. The top ancestry responses for Greater Hobart were English at 47.3, Australian 43.6, Irish, Scottish and German at 12.6, 10.1 and 4.1 respectively. Australia is known for its broad accent, but we also are known for our diversity of languages. There were over 300 separately identified languages in the 2016 census, and more than 1/5 of Australians, 21%, identified they spoke a language other than English at home. Mandarin was the most commonly spoken language after English, followed by Arabic, although they were a lot less in percentage at 2.5% and 1.4%. Of those who stated they spoke a language other than English at home, 82.3% spoke English well or very well, 12.7% did not speak English well, and 3.9% did not speak English at all. This means 3.5% of the Australian population, or 1 in 30, either don't speak English or don't speak English well. In Greater Hobart, Mandarin was the most common language spoken at home other than English at 1.3%, followed by Greek, Nepali and German. One of the most topical questions and themes in our census is religion. And religion actually gives another way to look at our diversity and our increasing diversity over time. Here is a view of our religious affiliation over the last 50 years. Reflecting the historical influence of European migration to Australia, Christianity was the most common religion reported in 2016 at 52%. Islam 2.6% and Buddhism 2.4% were the next most common religions reported. Nearly 1/3 of Australians reported in the census they had no religion in 2016. But if we look back 50 years to 1966, we can actually see that Christianity was nearly 90% of the population, with other religions less than 1% and no religion less than 1%. So there's been a huge shift over the last 50 years. In Greater Hobart, we had 47.3% were Christians, slightly lower than the Australian population. 2.9% said they had another religion, which is also lower than the Australian population, and 40.5% said they had no religion, which was about 10% higher than the Australian population. So religion is actually a story of age. Young people are more likely to report no religion, with young adults aged 18 to 34 years having 39% reporting no religion, and more likely to be affiliated with religions other than Christianity at 12%. Older people, particularly those aged 65 years and older, were more likely to report Christianity at 70%. The religious pattern of those under 18 is similar to those of 35 to 49-year-olds, suggesting the form may have been completed with the parents' beliefs. In terms of no religion, men were more likely to report not having a religion at 32% than women, 28%. However, there were differences when age was examined. Before the age of 25, there was very little differences between the sexes, with males just as likely as females to report having no religion or having no religion reported on their behalf. From the age of 25, the difference between men and women gradually widens and continues until the age of 74. The difference decreases slightly from the age of 75, but remains fairly stable. I'll now hand back over to Duncan.
So I think in my family, my religion got written down as what my daughter felt our religion was, because she did fill it out on behalf of the family. So it can probably happen in both directions. Something which hasn't changed much over the last 5 years has been our makeup of families in Australia. So we counted some 6.1 million families living together during the census, and the most popular family type was couples with children. So some 45% of families were couples of children, followed by 38% of families being couples without children. So this could be couples who have never had children, or it could be couples who have somehow worked out a way of convincing their children to leave home. And then some 16% of families are single-parent families. And you can see here that the vast majority of single-parent families, some 82% on census night, were female single-parent families. The proportion of male single-parent families has increased slightly over the last 5 years, but not hugely. If you wind back 25 years, you can see a little bit of a shift going on here. So families with children were about 9 percentage points higher, so about 53% of the population overall. So about 9% has gone to couples without children, has increased by 6%, so it's our biggest increasing group, and single-parent families have increased by some 3%. What you can also see here is the blue bar is slightly higher than the orange bar, which is because 51% of same-sex couples are male same-sex couples and 49% are female same-sex couples. But one really big difference between male and female same-sex couples we saw in the census was 1 in 4 female same-sex couples had children living with them at census time, compared to only 4.5% of male same-sex couples. Whilst there's been a significant increase, the proportion of same-sex couples, of all couples in Australia, is a very low percentage, but an increasing percentage. So you can see right across on the right-hand side, there's 0.91% of couples reported on the census for same-sex couples, which was an increase from 2011. Australian Capital Territory is the area where the highest proportion of couples reported as being in a same-sex couple on census night, followed by New South Wales. Another area of significant increase we saw in the census was the number of Australians living alone. So across Australia, 1 in every 4 households is a lone person household, so someone living alone. And that's actually 30% of households within Tasmania, so some 3 in 10 households within Tasmania. What this picture here represents, though, is the proportion of people at each different age that are living alone. And what you can see here is that probably quite pleasingly, there's not many 0 to 14-year-olds living alone, or they didn't fill out census forms. But then you can see it increased slightly, and between the ages of 20 and 50, males are more likely to be living alone than females. But then the proportion of a female population living alone increases dramatically through sort of later years. And if we overlay this with marital statistics, we can see 2 significant contributors to this. There's divorces, which then lead to people living alone. There's then widowing, which leads to people living alone. And so of the 85 to 89-year-old women in Australia, some 40% are living alone in the 2016 census, so a very high proportion of that population group. So one of the other things that we can see that increases dramatically with age is a need for assistance. So this is a core need for assistance with daily activities. It could be due to a disability, or it could be to do with the effects of ageing. And so this is assistance required every day, so quite heavy and intensive kind of assistance. We saw that the number of Australians needing assistance every day increased from 4.6% of the population to 5.1% over the last 5 years. And as you can see here, it significantly increases as your age does. So, but it actually increases it slightly earlier for females than males. So whilst the previous picture showed that at was a lot of males dying earlier, but males which are living longer are living without assistance longer. So an interesting phenomenon occurring there. 50% of women aged 85 to 89 require assistance, and it continues to increase steeply after that. 50% of males aged 90 to 94 required assistance. But actually, if a proportion of each of the older age groups diminished a little bit over the last 5 years, suggesting that our older population are living slightly healthier longer. But we've seen this increase right at the left-hand end there of young males requiring assistance. So you can see a little lump in the blue there. It's something that I think we need to have a little bit further of a look at. So with a lot of people needing assistance, a lot of people get assistance through unpaid care. So it might be a member of a family or a member of a community. And so this is a picture of Australians who've provided unpaid care to someone with a disability, a long-term illness, or the effects of ageing within the last 2 weeks. So it's probably quite a regular kind of occurrence. And so what you can see here is that it's a significant proportion of a population, but it has a really big crescendo sort of in the middle there. So between the ages of 50 through to 69 or so, a high proportion of a population are providing unpaid care to someone with a disability, a long-term illness. And in particular, females are. So 2 out of every 3 people providing unpaid care are female, and over 1 in 5 females aged 55 to 59 had to provide care within the last fortnight to unpaid care to someone else. And so this overlaps still with working age and other obligations as well. So there's an extra sort of load there we can see. The other thing that you can see in this chart is that from 80 to 84-year-old onwards, it's actually a higher proportion of men than women providing unpaid care, which lines up quite well with that previous picture of men requiring assistance themselves slightly later than females in older age range. So if providing unpaid care to your parents wasn't enough, you're also providing unpaid care for children other than your own. So this is a bit of a slide for grandparents of Australia. So this is the proportion of each age group that provides unpaid care within the last fortnight to someone else's children, so children that aren't their own. And so what you can see here is 60 to 69 years of age. It's nearly 1 in 4 of all females in Australia are providing unpaid care to someone else's children. I'm actually moving back to Tasmania later this year, and I'm looking forward to my mum helping out occasionally with my own children. So thanks, Mum. You can also see the grandfathers are doing their little bit here. With 65 to 69-year-olds, some 14% of men are providing unpaid care to children other than their own. This is the slide that causes the most consternation in Australian households on census night, as couples look at each other and try and work out which box are they allowed to tick, and how many hours of unpaid domestic work did they contribute around the household over the last week. Now, as the head of a census program, I earnestly looked at my wife and said, the last week isn't a fair representation of my usual contribution around the house. And Belle looked at me and said, well, the census says for last week, you need to put down the last week. So I was one of these 21% of males in Australia who have somehow managed to get away with not doing any hours of domestic work in the week before census night. The clear picture here is that the domestic duties, the domestic roles in Australia are still more significantly provided by females. And so over a quarter of females in Australia are providing 15 hours or more domestic work every single week, compared to only 8.2% of males. Before I get myself in trouble, I'll hand back to Georgia for the next section.
Yes, well, I was also in census land last year, and I still managed to do not quite 15 hours of unpaid domestic work, but more than none. Duncan. I've got a slide now that looks at, I've got a number of slides that are going to look at Australians' economic well-being. This map shows the median personal income for states. Information on income is actually collected in the census at a personal, household and family level. So this map is just the person level data. If the numbers look small or large to you, remember that it is the median, which is the midpoint. It is also not just income from salaries, but it's income from a range of other sources, such as pensions, superannuation, and other benefits. So across Australia, the median personal income was $662, while the median household income was $1,438 per week. The median personal income for people in Australia's greater capital cities was actually higher than Australia, which was at $701. And if you didn't live in a capital city, it was $597 per week. The median personal income for Greater Hobart was only $25 less than the whole of Australia at $637 per week, but for the whole of Tasmania, it was at $573 per week. Now let's look at tenure type. So this is a picture of Tasmania and Australia over the last 15 years by tenure type. In 1991, the most common tenure type for both Australia and Tasmania was for homes to be owned outright. In terms of 2016 though, we can see that across Australia, people owning a house with a household owning a house with a mortgage actually was higher than being owned outright, whereas Tasmania, a house owned with a mortgage still sat behind a house owned outright. The rental proportion of people renting their properties increased in both Australia and Tasmania over the last 15 years, with 30.9% of Australians renting and 27.3% of households in Tasmania renting. The next couple of slides is about how the amounts people pay to live in their homes. So this is housing costs, and it's the mortgage repayments for each of Australia's capital cities. It's in dollars per month. So for Greater Hobart, the median mortgage repayment, so the middle mortgage repayment, if you lined all mortgage repayments up in a line and took the median, was $1,402. For Australia, it was $1,755. 4 of the capital cities have mortgage repayments in excess of $2,000 a month. Mortgage repayments are highest in Darwin, Sydney, ACT and Perth. This is actually, this green line is actually the percentage of households paying greater than 30% of their monthly income on their mortgage repayments. So a higher proportion of households in Perth, Sydney and Melbourne spend more than 30% of their income on their mortgage. Almost 1 in 10 households in Perth spend over a third of their income in mortgage repayments. In ACT, while the median mortgage repayment is higher than that for Australia, they have the lowest proportion of households who spend more than a third of their income on mortgage, save Hobart. So now let's look at rental properties. In Greater Hobart, median rent is $260 per week compared to $230 for the whole of Tas. The median rent for Australia is $335 per week. Rent is highest in Sydney, Darwin, ACT and Perth. More Sydney households spend more of their income on rent than other cities, followed by Brisbane, Melbourne and Adelaide. I'm losing my slides. Where are they? Here we go. What this slide shows is proportionally more households have rental stress than mortgage stress. One factor is that interest rates are lower at this point in time. If interest rates increase, we'd expect a much larger proportion of households experiencing mortgage stress. So the green line is that mortgage stress, and in Greater Hobart, 10.9% of households pay more than 30% of their income on rent, versus 11.5% across Australia and 10.2% for the whole of Tasmania. And at least 1 in 10 households spend more than a third of their income on rent in all capital cities other than Perth and Canberra. And I guess the key thing here is that Hobart has the lowest median weekly rent. However, we still have that 1 in 10 households spending more than 30% of their income on rent, and this is because of our lower weekly income. If we combine the proportion of householders experiencing rental stress combined with mortgage stress for Hobart, it would add up to 16.2% of householders experiencing housing stress. Now back to Duncan.
Thanks, Georgia. So all of the data that we've shown you today is all freely available on the ABS website. So it's all published there and sort of ready to go. And so if you can bear with me for another couple of minutes, I'll just talk a little bit about how you can access that information. But we have a wide range of products on the ABS website designed to cater for every level of, data competence or geeky nerdiness. And so you can be right at a full-end geeky nerd like me through to an introductory user, and we've got something on the website that'll provide you with some good insights. So the ABS website, abs.gov.au, we want it to be the #1 government website. Anyone have a guess what the #1 government website is at the moment? Not Tax? Not Centrelink? No, not MyGov. It's pretty sunny today. So Bureau of Meteorology, a #1 website for traffic, and they don't even get their numbers right most days. So if you want a good website, come to abs.gov.au. So if you go to our website, there's not always a red circle around Census, but it's fairly easy to find up the top there. If you click on that, it'll take you to this simple page where what most people can do is go to that little search box there, and you can just start typing any geography you want in, whether that's Tasmania, Hobart, Blackmans Bay, or a postcode, a local government area, an electoral district. There's some 80,000 different options that you can put in there in terms of the geography, and you can bring up a nice simple quick stats for that area from 2016, 2011, 2006 and 2001, so you can look at it over a range of time periods. Down in the bottom corner there you've got the census stories. They're the most easy to use. They're not perfect as children bedtime stories, but they do work well for some adults. And then in the middle section there, you've got the access to all of it for different ABS products. So what do some of these products look like? So the stories are these kinds of things, so infographics, pictures. They're our analysis, which tries to bring out what we think is happening in the data. So we've already published some stories about Australia's cultural and linguistic diversity, about sex and gender diversity, some overview pictures of Australia, of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. And soon we'll be publishing more publications on things like ageing Australia and older Australians. And so to look out for those articles to get a nice sort of a digestible bite of census information. So quick stats looks like this. So this is quick stats for Austins Ferry Granton. It comes up with a little map in the corner. The map's really important to make sure that you're looking at what you think you're looking at. So if you look up Claremont and you end up in WA, then it's probably not the same population that you're after. So have a look at your little map to make sure that it's the boundaries of what you're looking at. And so what you get in quick stats is often, it's like the top five countries of birth, top 5 languages spoken at home, and how that compares against a state and against the nation. If that's not enough data for you, you can go to a community profile. So community profiles are also available for a lot of different areas, slightly fewer areas, but over 30,000 areas within Australia. And this allows you to download some detailed spreadsheets, so a good Excel spreadsheet with extra data. So rather than having the top 5, you might have a top 35 countries of birth or the top 35 languages spoken at home. There's also a few different community profiles. So there's our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's profile, so that looks at just the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders within a community. There's also a time series profile, and so that allows you to compare really easily in one spreadsheet 2016 versus 2011 versus 2006, and we make sure that the geographies line up between those, so you're comparing apples with apples. Table Builder is where you can get your full-on geek on. That's where you can get in and build your own tables. The ABS's 2.8 million tables aren't enough for you, and you can get in and build your own. And so you can choose whatever geography you want. You can choose whatever you want in the rows and whatever you want in the columns, and hit the play button and it'll build a data set for you from Census of that community. It also has an ability to show it on maps and also produce graphs for you. So it's a really powerful kind of product. We've released most census data already, but there's still more to come. So in October, we release all of our employment data, so labour force participation, industry of employment, occupation, qualifications, as well as data on how people travel to work, and also internal migration within Australia, so where people lived 1 year ago and 5 years ago. So that's our next set of releases, and when they come out, they'll get added into all of those existing products. They just take us a little bit more time to prepare. In December, we released Australia's census longitudinal data set, and then next year there's a number of following releases coming out. Okay, so we're going to have some time for some open questions from the floor. We've also got, I'll just give you a bit of a rundown on what we're doing from here. So we'll do some open questions from the floor, and we've got a few of my colleagues at the back of the room who'll be able to help you who actually look at some of the products and get on the website if you want to have a bit of a look and see something, or you've got a particular question, they can help you with that. We've also got some afternoon tea in the room at the back and a coffee for people to have, and Georgia and myself will be around for some time yet, where we can also answer sort of questions one-on-one and try and help you out. But I'd like to open the floor up for sort of any questions. We've got a microphone at the back, so if you just put your hand up, we'll run a microphone down to you, and yeah, we'd love to help. It's always hard, the first question. Hey, we've got someone brave enough, thank you.
So, fairly obvious question, interested in the impact of the glitches with the website and how that affected the numbers that you got, responses you got for the census and the credibility of the data?
Yep, good questions. So firstly, the impact was a fair few grey hairs for me and a bit of a stressful time period. I guess the good news is that it hasn't had an impact on the quality of a census overall. And so one of the things that we did straight after census night was we did something we've never done before. We formed an independent panel of quality advisors for this census. So we brought together 3 academics. So Professor Peter McDonald, who's Australia's, I think, principal demographer. He's based at University of Melbourne, plus another couple of esteemed demographers, a former Australian statistician, a former deputy statistician of Statistics Canada, and Anton Voss, a member of Premier and Cabinet here, a government employee here, who formed an advisory panel for us. And they spent over the sort of 8 months of data processing. They met a number of times and analysed anything that they wanted to in terms of tables of data in order to come to an independent view of the quality of a census. And so when we released the census a few weeks ago now, they published their report on the same day, and they said that the data is of the same quality as what it's been in 2011 and 2006 and can be used with confidence. What they said specifically about the online form outage was the same as what we believe, is that it did unfortunately lead to some people completing on paper who would have otherwise completed online. So people would have been ready to go, they might have been halfway through. If they had a paper form ready to go, then they'd probably switch across to a paper form. In terms of the census data quality overall, well, that's how we used to get all of the data, and you get high quality data on paper. But it's more an impact in terms of, unfortunately, our reputation, but we sort of let down Australians on that night. But yeah, from a quality of a data perspective, we've got the big green tick, so it's good. One at the back left, one front middle.
I just missed on the slide before the timing of the release of the homelessness data.
Sorry, I missed that.
The timing of the release,
homeless?
the homelessness data?
Yeah, so March next year, we think, at this stage, which is the same schedule as last time. So we capture some information on homelessness directly in the census, so people experiencing rough sleeping on census night, and so that data is very immediately available. But some of the other measures of people experiencing homelessness take a while to sort of bring together and compile. So people which are couch surfing are harder to identify in the data, people which are in crisis accommodation. So there's a few more sort of quality assurance processes we go through, so next year. Yeah. Right at the back left, Cara. Yeah. Thank you.
In 2021, will we have the option of completing a paper form?
Yeah, definitely. So we expect we'll continue to move forward with a strategy that it facilitates it's online and as a first option for households, but we can see that still 37% of households in Australia participated on paper, and we expect that to be a smaller proportion in 2021, but it'll still be a significant proportion. We're also looking at other methods to help facilitate people filling out the census form. So we'll look at other methods. Do people who want support of an interviewer? So particularly of an ageing population, some people might actually need an interview rather than writing it down themselves, or we'll also look at telephone interviewing as well. So the idea will be to increase the options to make it as easy as possible for people. All right. Okay, well, we might call the plenary session and quits there. Thank you very much for your attendance. I hope you got some value out of that, and I look forward to talking to some of you separately. So thanks.